My name is Sam Boskey. I was born in Detroit, about a mile from Canada. I grew up when I was young. I was back in Montreal by the age of 2 years old and lived down between Guy and Atwater near the Forum, and moved to NDG when I was about 6 years old. And apart from a few years when I was living downtown near McGill, I've been back in NDG for most of my life now.
And you went to English school, French school?
I went to school in English, but I was at a Jewish parochial school I started off at a community Red Feather Youth Center. Red Feather was the ancestors of Centraide. And so I went to nursery school there for several years, and then I was at the Jewish Parrot School from kindergarten till grade 7. I was at the Protestant School Board of Greater Montreal, Monklands High School in NDG for high school, and then I went on to McGill.
And what did you study at McGill?
Well, I was there on several occasions. The first time I had a BA, mostly in social science, in poli-sci, philosophy, economics, sociology. I was out working for half a dozen years, and I came back and I did a degree in law.
And what did you do before getting involved in municipal politics? What kind of political involvement were you there?
I must have been rather young. I guess my first organized political involvement I can think of might have been in high school. I was editor of the school paper when I was in grade 10. I was vice president of the Students' Council when I was in grade 11. And when I got to McGill, I became involved in student politics nearly right away. I was working for the McGill Daily, which was a very political paper in those days. Several months into that year, the McGill Daily ran an article about research for the American military, which was being done by some professors in the engineering department. And the Students' Council reacted to engineering students being very unhappy with this and fired the daily editor. And rather immediately there was an organization called Students for a Democratic University, which was organized to try to protest against this. And I ended up becoming active in SDU. And SDU took a relatively broad approach, became quite influenced by what had been going on in the rest of Canada and the States in terms of trying to democratize the universities. So for
what year was this roughly?
Oh, this would have been, I was at McGill between 66 and 70.
Okay.
And by 68, for example, there were student strikes trying to democratize the university, get student representation onto various departments. There was campaigns at that point to try to get McGill students to join UGEC, which was the basically French language Union Générale des Étudiants du Québec, and because McGill Students Society had very little contact with French university students up till then. At the time I was at McGill, there was the McGill Français demonstration, which was a big citywide, if not province-wide, campaign to try to, as I guess we put it at the time, open up to the reality of Quebec in the end of the 20th century. The Université de Québec didn't exist yet, and the French universities were very overcrowded, and McGill was offering very, very little in French at the time. So there was a big campaign at that point.
And what was the reaction of people at McGill, like in SDU, for instance?
Oh, well, SDU had, there were a lot of students who were interested in it and followed it. There were some SDU students ran in various internal campaigns for Students' Council and got elected. At one point, the entire Student Society executive was SDU people. But on the whole, in those days, there were certain faculties which were far more right-wing and certain faculties which were more left-wing. I mean, the engineering faculties, some of the professional faculties, the commerce faculties, for the most part, elected more conservative students. The arts, science, education, medicine sometimes had more progressive students being elected. There was a lot of discussion. What was important in the college in those days was that there was a McGill Daily. So there was news every day, and everybody could be informed about a lot of information, and things moved relatively quickly. If a newspaper only comes out once a week or every 2 weeks or something like this, events move far less quickly.
So the late 60s were a very tumultuous time for student movements and so on, and across the world. What was the difference between what was going on at McGill and I guess Sir George Williams at the time and some of the French universities? What were some of the issues? Like where were the common points and what were some of the differences?
Well, I think in common points, there was always questions of government financing of universities. There was the questions of democracy in terms of the sense of to what extent students were allowed to participate in the functionings of the universities. I guess the English students were probably far more aware of what was going on again in the rest of Canada and the States. The Vietnam War was going on, and we had a lot of American students in Montreal at the time, both at McGill and at Sir George, and this was an ongoing issue. A lot of draft dodgers who came and who were students at McGill at the time. And the civil rights movement in the States, the fight for racial equality and against institutionalized racism in the States, involved a lot of organizing, and that had a fair bit of a spillover, I think, in the English universities, that in the sense that we were much more aware and much more conscious of what was going on, because again of the Vietnam War going on, we became also aware of the interrelationship between the universities and the what would become known as the military-industrial complex. That is, there was all sorts of research for the military going on. There was all sorts of recruitment for arms and weapons-producing companies going on. At the McGill Placement Center, for example, the campus recruitment center, there was the university. Held all sorts of investments, in companies which were involved in the military. So I guess the English language universities were probably more sensitive to some of these issues. In the French language universities, again, they were growing. The cégeps just opened part way through when I was an undergraduate. So you had, for the first time, a tremendous number of students who had not come out of the classical colleges, who were going on to post-secondary university or post-secondary studies. And this was, again, very much a class issue, because most of working class French language students didn't go on or would have gone on to short-term technical training, but suddenly the gates of the cégeps were open to students who would be interested in in going on to a whole variety of professions, which hadn't been open to their elder siblings or clearly not to their parents. So there was a lot of excitement. The end of the 60s, again, that was the heyday of the Quiet Revolution, and that there was a lot of, not only was institutionally was the Quebec government opening up education, but opening up medical services which were taken over by the government, getting involved in the government getting involved in the economy in a big way in terms of investments, the Caisse de dépôt. And there was a lot of cultural activity going on. French writers, French musicians, French rock bands, French poets, French magazines, French literary scene. There was a real bubbling of activity, probably far more on the French side than there was amongst English students at the time. So there was a lot, it was an exciting time to be going to university.
Was there any dialogue going on between the French student movements and the English student movement?
Well, there was through UGEC, the Union Générale des Étudiants de Québec, which was the Federation of French University Student Associations. The Cégeps weren't part of that at the beginning, but the McGill had traditionally belonged to an English-Canadian association, the Canadian University of Students. There was debates at McGill for a fair number of years about whether McGill should leave CUS and join UJEC. And there were some referendums. Eventually McGill, by a close vote, decided to join UJEC. I spent some time at a UJEC, both at UJEC decision-making conferences, but also at a summer semaine syndicale, a sort of a student union training session where we went up to a summer camp for a week or 10 days and learned a certain amount about government structures and about financing in universities and about organization and student journalism and various kinds of tools which would help student unions to be able to become a bit more efficient.
We're going to move on to the Montreal Citizens Movement. How did that come about? What was it? When was it formed? And how were you involved? A lot of questions.
Well, formally the MCM, Montreal Citizens Movement, was formed in 1974, but the roots of it go back. In the late 60s, there was a fair bit of community organizing which started in various neighborhoods, mostly working class neighborhoods. There was the first tenants associations, there were community health clinics, there were community legal clinics, and there was, a network of various groups who were quite interested in social change. Again, the end of the 60s was the union movement was getting stronger, the student movement was stronger, the what we refer to then as the women's liberation movement was getting stronger. So there was a convergence of a lot of groups who were working for social change. There was politically in Montreal at the time, Mayor Drapeau, who had started off 25 years earlier as a progressive reformer, but had become a very closed conservative mayor. Whereas in the early 60s, the provincial Liberals had set off the quiet revolution with their the nationalization of hydro and the setting up of an education ministry in Cégeps and the Parent Commission. The Union Nationale ended up winning an election, coming substantially behind the Liberals in the popular vote, but because of the way the electoral map was done at that point, they ended up winning. So there was a lot of frustration that conventional political activity was not having the desired results. By the end of the 60s, there was a sort of a loose federation of community groups in Montreal called the Rassemblement des Associations Populaires de bas et l'Est de la Ville. And they, by the 1970, as the 1970 election was approaching, formed a political party called FRAP, the Front d'Action Politique, which ran a bunch of city councillors for the 1970 election. We have to remember that in the fall of 1970, the election was a bit overshadowed by some political kidnappings and the declaration of martial law and the army occupying Montreal at the time. It ended up, there ended up being 400 political activists who were arrested, many of whom were never charged, but this put a big dent in the election. And some of the FRAP candidates ended up being arrested as well.
And was it a mix of francophones and anglophones? Like, what was the mix?
FRAP had been strongest mostly in francophone areas. There were a certain number of Anglos involved. I started volunteering at the FRAP office doing translations. And during the campaign, which had happened just after I had graduated from McGill, I went back to McGill in the fall and recruited about 50 students to do door-to-door work for FRAP candidates in the student ghetto, the area just east of McGill. And in fact, it was in that area that one of the FRAP candidates got the highest vote in the city. Again, FRAP lost all its seats, and with the War Measures Act going on, one candidate got about 1/3 of the vote, which was considered relatively good at the time. There were, again, the English student press, the Daily, the Georgian, paid a lot of attention to, and the Montreal Star, paid a lot of attention to the election campaign. So Anglophones were, on the whole, quite informed of what FRAP was doing. But FRAP didn't run candidates in too many of the English-speaking areas. In NDG, where I was at the time, I remember we held a meeting at the beginning of the campaign between several FRAP organizers and the NDG Association of the NDP and the NDG Association of the Parti Québécois to decide, did we feel that we had the means to run a candidate, and the decision was no. So some of us ended up doing some work in other ridings. FRAP, within the next couple of years, dissolved. Some of the local organizations ended up becoming more militant and got involved in union organizing and political organizing and doing political writing. Other groups sort of moved away. But as in the 1970 election, Drapeau won 100% of the vote. And so City Council ended up being not very much interested in the next 4 years because there was no debates. The meetings were very short. Everybody said yes, yes, yes to everything without debate. And as a result, municipal politics didn't move very much further. But by the time 1974 came around, which was the next election, there was a considerable amount of interest in trying to not repeat the FRAP experience, but to try to again present a kind of united front against Drapeau, and that's what became the MCM, called it the RCM in French, the Rassemblement des Citoyens de Montréal. And there, both the Quebec NDP, the Montreal NDP, the Montreal Parti Québécois, and a group of Anglophone community organizations which were federated into something called the Urban Progressive Movement, got together and basically put together the RCM before the 1974 election.
Who were some of the leaders of the RCM?
Well, in the early days, some of the people who later, became known at other levels were there. One of the first leaders was Paul Clich, who was elected to council in 1974, and who is still around as an activist, still writing and still blogging and still quite involved in Québec Solidaire these days. Jean Drapeau, who later became mayor, was on the first executive of the MCM. Léa Cousineau, who years later would become chair of the executive committee when the MCM was in office, was very active in the MCM in those days at the beginning.
And when and how did you get involved?
Well, I became involved right at the beginning, having already been involved in FRAP and been involved. There were several hundred of us who got involved in the beginning of when the MCM was put together. I was working in Côte-Neige in those days, so I became involved in the Côte-Neige district and in the campaign in Côte-Neige, doing door-to-door for some of the councillors. In '74, we still had the old electoral map where there were large electoral districts which each elected 3 city councillors. So everybody got 3 separate ballots to vote for seat A, seat B, and seat C. And in in the 74 election, the MCM won about a third of city council, including the 3 seats in Côte-des-Neiges, and including all the seats in NDG as well. And these were, again, mostly Anglophone ridings. Again, the MCM won in a fair number of Francophone ridings as well. So there would have been, about a third of the councillors came from English districts.
And what was the political platform? I mean, how did you reconcile the NDP points of view and the PQ points of view?
Well, there was there was quite a considerable overlap. I mean, there was no particular difficulty there. There was an understanding that, while, on the provincial level, people were often separated on, their opinions on Quebec nationalism. But there was an agreement that on the municipal level this would not be brought up. People could vote differently federally or they could vote differently provincially, but they worked together municipally. So the PQ, which had in those days was probably a far more progressive party than it is now, and the people from the NDP, for the most part, there was no particular problem. Within the MCM as well. I mean, in 74, there were people from all over the spectrum who were involved. It was more a common front against Drapeau. There were a lot of people from these two parties. There were people further to the left. There were people more on the right. There was lots of liberals, and even, I remember, several social credit voters who came out to support the MCM. But a lot of people who became involved and who voted for the MCM were not people who had been particularly involved in politics before. The MCM major program at that point was a question of trying to democratize the city. In those days, Drapeau handpicked his city councillors. There were no question periods at meetings. The Drapeau didn't believe in press conferences. There were very often articles written, by municipal city hall journalists explaining how difficult it was to be a city hall journalist because the civil service was under orders not to talk to the journalists, and Drapeau didn't talk to journalists, and so it was very difficult to do, standard coverage, of municipal affairs, whether it be public works or recreation or different kinds of affairs. One of the councillors who was elected in 74 was the journalist Nick Aftermar at that time, who started off his political career with the MCM. And he worked on trying to expose the finances behind the Olympic Games, which were in the process of being organized by that time. And it was very difficult. There was very little information available. So the MCM was able to, by promising an open city hall, by promising democratization, by promising to decentralize certain kinds of decision making, by making a lot of the information public, that in itself was enough to attract a lot of attention and a lot of support from people in various parts of the city, and whether they were English or French had nothing to do with it.
So aside from wanting to democratize City Hall, what were some of the other issues brought up by the MCM?
Well, the MCM brought up issues of budgeting. I can remember, during the 1970 campaign, if we want to go back looking at budgeting, one of the points that FRAP was able to make, which received a lot of attention, was that the city was spending more on police horses than it was spending on public housing. The MCM became quite concerned with housing. The city was way behind many other cities of the same size across the country in terms of having public housing, to a certain extent because the provincial government then, as now, placed all sorts of restrictions on federal government monies coming to the cities. So when the federal government through Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, as it was then known, started funding public housing, started funding cooperatives. It was far more difficult to get that kind of money into Quebec. When Montreal started receiving public housing money, Toronto already had 10,000 public housing units. And it's been a catch-up game ever since. So the MCM was really quite concerned with public housing, was concerned with public transport, was concerned from the early days about decreasing the fees. In fact, the MCM program originally called for free public transport.
So it was a progressive program?
Oh, it was a progressive program. It was I mean, it wasn't a socialist program in the sense that it wasn't, the city has very little control over the nuts and bolts of the economy, so it wasn't a question so much of nationalization of industries, but it was very much a question of trying to get democratic control. So that meant that so users of services might have some say, whether it's a question of having parks departments, whether it was a questions of having questions of zoning. Montreal was very closed as far as zoning, whereas other cities, for example, Toronto, there was public information about zoning changes all the time in public meetings, and I was even interviewed once in Toronto to work for the planning department, running a community zoning consultation office. But Montreal was decades behind that. So very often people had no idea that zoning changes had been approved. There was no open process. Developers often would make deals with the mayor behind closed doors. There was no commissions of city council. There was no public debate really on policy. There were press releases announcing what decisions had already been taken. So the idea of really trying to move the city into the 20th century, to have public awareness, public information about all aspects of city development. There was no lack of issues dealing with democratization and opening up the city hall to be dealt with, because nearly everything was closed to the public.
In terms of the movement itself, was it did the English-French mix in the movement, was it fairly representative of the city at large? Was it more Anglophone? Was it more Francophone? What would you say? And what language did you use among each other?
Well, generally, I mean, the party congresses would operate pretty much in French. I mean, some people spoke English from time to time. But the party local associations generally operated in the area of the majority population of that area. So in NDG, for example, and we had one of the largest organizations in NDG for a long time, we operated nearly entirely in English. In Côte-des-Neiges, they operated in English. In the downtown area, a lot of that was operating in English. While in the rest of the city, it would have operated probably nearly entirely in French. It corresponded to the language of the residents, and there was probably less bilingualism there at that time than there is now. Probably, many of the Anglophones in NDG probably, would have, had difficulty taking part in organizations which are operated entirely in French. So but the people who ended up both being on city council, the people who were elected as representatives, from the English neighborhoods, were people who could generally get along in French. I mean, anecdotally, some of the Anglophone, representatives, even some of the city councillors, stumbled a little bit at the beginning, but as time went on, their French improved considerably. And I can think of, no occasion that comes to mind. To me, was there really tension between English and French based on, on neighborhood rivalries, or based on, the fact that one linguistic group didn't like people from the other linguistic group? We were all there together with a certain program, with a certain, general political orientation, and I think we got to learn a lot about each other. for all my years spent in municipal politics, at the same time I learned a lot about French popular music, about French writers, French theatre, and a lot about parts of the city that I was less familiar with than I had been when I first was elected.
So what did the MCM do while it was in opposition? And eventually in the 80s it became the party, the party in power. So
Yeah.
how did that change?
Well, the MCM had about a third of the seats in council between 74 and 78. In 78, another party got set up which split the vote. Their mayoralty candidate was Serge Royal, who had been active in the student union UJEC and later became a senator. And they tried to portray the MCM as being too far to the left, and so they tried to set themselves up in the middle. But what they ended up doing was basically splitting the vote, and so in the 78 election, Drapeau won nearly every seat in the city again, and the only one councillor from this new party, which was called the Groupe d'Action Municipal, GAM, or MAG in English, got elected. And only one MCM councillor got elected. That was Michael Feinstadt, who, again, had been previously elected in 74. So by the time 1982 came around again, which was the election after that, there were negotiations going on between the MAG and the MCM to try to see whether they could work out a joint program or whether they could split, agree not to run in certain districts. But that came to naught. I was involved in negotiations on behalf of the MCM at the time. And so ultimately both parties ran head-to-head against Drapeau, but the MAG elected 3. The MCM elected 14 at the time, and therefore became a much stronger opposition, because the 3 elected from MAG had very little to do with each other. I'm not sure they even liked each other, and they didn't function as a coordinated group, while the MCM team was really quite hardworking and did a lot of work. Between 82 and 86, there was a lot of work done on housing. For example, Arnold Bennett, who had been one of the 1974 councillors and lost in 78, but got elected in 82, had by then become Mr. Tenants' Rights as far as English Montreal was concerned, with columns in the newspapers and shows on the radio, and bringing the nuts and bolts of tenants' rights to Montrealers in a way it hadn't been done before. There had been various tenants associations that had been existing for quite a while. I had worked for one of them in Cotonage in the early 70s, but the media had never really picked up very much until Arnold became a bit of a minor media star. And so as a councillor, he attracted a lot of attention as far as tenants' rights. We did leafleting during the 1982 campaign about tenants' rights, and after many of us were elected in 82, for years on we would be receiving dozens of calls from tenants every day looking for tenants' rights information. So the MCM was very much identified with tenants' rights. Again, identified with public transport, identified with trying to democratize decisions, especially as far as the budget. The MCM started to pay a fair bit of attention to environmental issues, which was the first time that a municipal political party had done that. Looking at pollution, looking at the role of public transport, looking at water, wastewater, looking at questions of air pollution in various ways, and in recycling. Some of the local MCM associations had got involved in small community recycling projects, but the party put this forward. And various, as the 1982 to 86 term progressed, it became relatively evident that the Drapeau's party was starting to run into trouble. And midway through the 1986 year, several months before the election, Drapeau announced that he was not going to run again. And the impact of this was to bring in thousands of new people into the MCM who realized that it was time for a change and that they wanted to be part of it. The impact of this was twofold. I mean, the MCM, which traditionally had about between 2,000 and 3,000 members, might have had about 6,000 members before the 1986 election, but by election day they were up over 20,000 members. But all sorts of people who had no political background at all joined the MCM. Many of them wanted to become candidates. A fair number of them ended up becoming candidates and got elected to city council, even though their familiarity with community organizing or the kind of work that the MCM had done while it was in the opposition was nearly negligible. So the Drapeau's party ended up being nearly destroyed. There was only one councillor from Drapeau's party who was elected in '86, and that had been a very low-key councillor who was very shy about speaking in public, and for all practical purposes, the party ended up having no further influence. But the MCM, on the other hand, had this problem of having a tremendous amount of support. They won 55 out of 58 seats in 1986, but with half the caucus that hadn't been members of the party a year before, and whose major loyalty was to the Jean Drapeau ticket, and not necessarily to the the previous 15 years of party program or party struggles in the neighborhoods.
Let's just go back a bit. When did you get elected, for what riding, and for how long?
I was elected I was first elected in 1982, and I was there for 4 terms, representing what was called the Dakari district, which was the eastern part of NDG. The map changed a little bit from time to time, and we went from 4 districts in NDG to 3 at the time. Now there are 2. But for the most part, I represented both the southern and the eastern parts of NDG. And the MCM at the time in NDG, again both in '74 and then in '82, won all the NDG seats. Again in '86, when the MCM won citywide, all of NDG was again won by MCM people.
How was the MCM in its early years? Was it a form of community organizing? Was it different from your average political party?
It varied from district to district. Many of the people who got involved in the MCM were already involved in various community activities in their own districts. And there was, after the first councillors were elected in the '70s, and then later on in the '80s, many of the local MCM associations also got involved in community work. The committees locally working with housing groups, committees concerned with urban planning, committees who were working with park committees, people who were working on various traffic issues, people who helped set up housing co-ops. There was a lot of MCM people who were both working in community groups, but also bringing more political ideas into the community groups, not necessarily recruiting people, but it was understood in those days that the city hall would be able to pass various kinds of policies and legislation which would make life easier for the community groups to do the work that had to be done at the base. I mean, the city had limited budgets, always had limited budgets. We have a municipal financing system which is based on property tax, and in a city which is mostly tenants, every time you raise municipal taxes, you're raising rents, which was somehow counterproductive. So the the city could not spend money completely irresponsibly, and didn't have huge amounts of staff, but policies could indeed make things easier for community groups. So after the MCM was elected in 1986, for example, there was encouragement for nonprofit housing corporations. There was improvement for various groups who are involved in community groups of various sorts, whether it was groups dealing with park associations or groups who were concerned about cultural associations or things like this, to be able to act with more confidence and to be able to, in certain occasions, get a certain amount of financing from the city.
You mentioned that there was a difference between kind of the MCM old guard and the people who were the newcomers who came in the wake of the 1986 election, who were attracted to this sort of Jean Drapeau ticket. What is this Jean Drapeau ticket? What were some of the differences there?
Well, one can see, parallels often with, in many countries or in many different levels of government. Drapeau himself had started off as being very active in student politics. He was the president of the Students' Association at Université de Montréal, which had, I think, close to 30,000 students at the time. He later went to McGill, got a master's in poli-sci at McGill, but before the PQ was elected in '76, he had worked as a political attaché to René Lévesque for a certain period of time, but he was no longer doing that by the time the PQ got elected. He had become a lawyer, had been working for the CSN, the Labour Federation. He had also done a lot of work for SF, which was an association of dealing with consumer rights and helping people with budgeting issues, especially people in working class areas. And he had a television show, which was on Radio Québec, later Télé-Québec, for years dealing with consumer rights. So he was very well known across the province by people who knew nothing about his political interests. In fact, it was even a bit of an embarrassment during the 1982 campaign when he was running to be mayor, that they were still showing reruns of his SF TV shows where his hair was down to his shoulders, while the Drapeau, the mayoralty candidate, was much more conservatively coiffed. There was, as there often is in an attempt to, one can either do a lot of political education of the public to bring them over to more progressive ideas, or one can move policies more to the center and dilute the rough edges in order to try and get more support. This has happened in nearly every political movement in the last 200 years. Within the MCM, the people who had been working in the grassroots, in the late '60s and the early '70s, who were quite experienced in terms of fighting various government departments or fighting various company owners or employers or landlords, had developed certain kinds of attitudes which many of the latecomers didn't have. I think many of us in the early days weren't necessarily interested, or at least I can speak for myself, in being managers of the city. We're far more interested in decentralizing the city, democratizing the city. The idea of running the transit corporation or running the housing corporation, I don't know of anybody, can think of one or two people who had intentions in that direction, but for the most of the part it was the questions of breaking the monopoly of power and spreading it amongst the public so that there could be feelings of general community solidarity and people working with each other collectively. Some of the ideas were relatively vague, but the idea was to break the stranglehold and to change the political model. So one of the first things that the MCM did after its election in 1986 was to set up public question periods, to set up commissions of council, which would be holding public meetings across the city. But from the beginning, one started to see a bit of a difference between those who wanted to decentralizing the decision-making power as opposed to those who really merely wanted to make it more transparent. As compared to the system we have in Montreal now in the 2020s, where there are boroughs that have decision-making power, that have their own jurisdictions, that have their own budgets, and that different neighborhoods can have their own zoning rules and their own traffic rules and their own playground regulations. The MCM, throughout its 8 years in power, never really decentralized decision-making. They opened it up, they made it far more transparent, but the neighborhood consultative committees, the Comité Conseil d'Arrondissement, which existed, could hold public hearings, could hold meetings where the public could come and ask questions, but they could only pass recommendations to the city's executive committee. So there was no real decisions which were taken in the neighborhoods. And one had to wait until actually after the MCM was no longer in power before there was a real transfer of decision-making power into the neighborhoods.
So you left the MCM. When did your kind of disenchantment come about?
Well, enchantment is a long time coming. Even by the night of the great victory in 1986, when the MCM won 55 out of 58 seats, while the crowds that were at the Palais de Commerce that night, the old Chaumart where the Bibliothèque Nationale is now, who were yelling and screaming and happy, I was rather depressed that night, because we would have had a much politically stronger caucus had there only been 30 members. With the 55, it meant that there was all sorts of people with all sorts of different political opinions who were there, and I realized that evening that it was going to be far more bumpy than we would have liked. And there were, I think while everybody was happy all the 55 who were elected were very happy to be there, many of them were really not political. Many of them were not really progressive people. They generally behaved quite well in the sense that they could follow party discipline, but many of them weren't they had no background in community organizing. They really weren't interested in working with people in their neighborhoods in terms of trying to produce social change. City councillors will be answering questions all the time about people who have problems with the zoning department and wanting to know the rule for this and that, and the phone keeps ringing all the time. But there had been a tradition in the MCM of the elected people playing an active role in community organizing, whatever the issues were. And just to give an example, in NDG, when there was a vacant school, my old high school, Monkland's High School, sitting empty, the councillors organized a community consultation on what the best use of that school might be. And ultimately, we did this while in opposition, but we finally had a full plan available with a consensus from the community, so that when the Doré administration won, we were able to get the City Housing Corporation to buy the building, and it became both a community center and a residence. as a city councillor in the opposition, I worked with various groups at the NDG Community Council who were interested in getting a CLSE in NDG. At the beginning, the CLSEs weren't set up everywhere. They were set up in certain priority areas. But in terms of what our CLSE would look like and what impact it would have on existing other health services, for example, the Head and Hands, which was a community youth clinic, which had been around for a good dozen years at that point. We ended up organizing various community meetings to try and fashion a policy for which we could then approach the provincial government in terms of getting a CLSE. So the city councillors, many of us anyhow, were quite involved in working on various community issues, not all of which necessarily were directly municipal issues, but they were issues which were of concern to the people in our communities.
So you mentioned some of the local community organizations like NDG, Community Council, Head and Hands. How did MCM interact with some of the bigger English-speaking community organizations like Alliance Quebec, for instance?
Alliance, for the most part, the MCM avoided getting involved in other parties. In fact, and involved in issues which were seen as being issues at other political levels. In the early days, at least, and maybe even throughout the MCM's life, as part of its statutes, its constitution, in order to preserve its independence and not get involved in fights at the provincial or the federal level, it was part of the rules that nobody who held any position of authority in the MCM could hold a position of authority in another party. So the way that played itself out is that when one of these 1974 city councillors was elected to the executive of his local Parti Québécois association, he was asked to choose between the two because the MCM didn't want itself publicly identified as being affiliated with other political parties. And in this particular case, the councillor decided to resign from the MCM and sat out the rest of his term as an independent. At the same time, or a bit later, there was a provincial election, and several of the MCM councillors, Nick Aftermar and Bob Keaton, who were both MCM councillors from the Côte-de-Neige area, decided to run for a new provincial party called the Democratic Alliance. And they, too, ended up sitting as independents for the rest of their session. So there was a clear conscious attempt not to get involved in issues which would be divisive. The people at come provincial elections, people who might work together at the city level might work for other parties at the federal level or the provincial level. And for the most part, this was really quite successful. In the mid-'80s, there was an attempt to try to have a debate at City Council on the merits of the language law of Bill 101, and I think the attempt of both Drapeau and Nick Aftermar, who was no longer with the MCM at that point, was to try and see if they could provoke a split in the MCM. But the MCM was wary about this, and they took people with several of their members with various different political opinions and locked them in a room and told them not to come out until they'd come out with a compromise position, which was adopted by the party. And I'm not sure that the compromise position reflected the opinions of any one of the individual members, but it was a working model which would allow both independentists and federalists to continue to work together.
What was the compromise position?
Well, the idea was that there wouldn't be a head-on challenge to the fact that French was declared to be the official language, but that as far as services to individuals were concerned, that people needed the languages that they could understand. In Toronto at the same time, many important documents on city policies were being translated into 14 languages. The Doré administration, after it was elected in the mid-'80s, set up the Bureau Interculturel de Montréal. This would have been a couple of years after the event I'm talking about, where they had people speaking many different languages who could work as interpreters and also cultural ambassadors between the city and the different cultural communities to try and make sure that everybody felt useful. So the MCM stayed away from from the divisive issues, and right and through until it dissolved, there was still active organizations in English parts of town and French parts of town. There were English-speaking city councillors and French-speaking city councillors, and there was far more that they had in common, and there were other outlets for where there were differences. There was other provincial parties, there was other federal parties.
Were you involved in any way with Alliance Quebec? I mean, you mentioned Bob Keaton, who was also on the MCM, who later became president of Alliance.
That was later. No, I was not involved in Alliance Quebec. Again, I stayed away from other activities. I was invited occasionally to take part in a panel, as I was with many different kinds of organizations across the city, but I was never active in Alliance Quebec. No.
Why did you leave the MCM? What was the tipping point?
Well, many of us were concerned that the party was changing, that it was more concerned with administering the city with a more business model, and that it was abandoning many of the people who had first gotten together to try to elect. There was a bit of slowness after the Doré administration took part in terms of questions of democratization. There was a questions of what the role of the party would be vis-a-vis the new administration. At the time of the 1986 election, I had been a member of the party's central executive. I was a delegate of the caucus on the executive, and but within a few weeks of the election, when at a party's general council meeting, when some of the members were questioning the fact that the city administration had just announced some kind of program which this person thought was not compatible with the MCM's political program, Doré ended up taking the microphone to say, look, I'm now mayor of all the Montrealers, and which to say that the party was considered to be one pressure group against many. It wasn't the party which was going to run the city. And that was a clear message. The administration emptied the party of a lot of its gray matter. By that I mean a lot of the best organizers and a lot of the people who had been very active in many of the district associations got jobs at City Hall. They became political attachés. They became various kinds of aides. And the center of gravity of the party moved to City Hall. And because City Hall was where the action was, the party itself was left with very little to do. Even when it became clear that there was various issues which were against party policy, there was no desire amongst most of the party members to try to censor the administration. It would look bad, but a lot of people wanted to give the benefit of the doubt to the administration. The first major crack would have come, I guess, with the Overdale dossier. Overdale was a block in downtown, just below René Lévesque, then Dorchester Avenue, between Mackay and Crescent, which had a series of low-rise buildings, a lot of rooming houses, mostly entirely working-class people, and a group of developers got their hands on most of the land. One of the developers who had some contact with the MCM, and the MCM was able to give them permission to demolish the whole block and to put up several buildings which would have had, I think, something like 30 stories in the original zoning bylaw.
There was some kind of resistance movement at Overdale. Did you know some of the people involved with that? Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Move back over? Oh, when the Overdale project was first announced, there was a tremendous wave of stupefaction amongst many MCM members and in many people in the rest of the city. The MCM had been known for years as a tenants' rights party, and here suddenly the tenants were going to be evicted in great numbers without any, there weren't any compensation programs in order to give some speculative landowners the ability to put up high-rises. This was completely against everything that the MCM had been talking about in terms of consultative planning, in terms of the questions of what kind of urban development should take place, for whom, and who should be doing the urban development. Should people with money get the chance to make the decisions about what the city would look like, or was it going to be debated democratically?
So was that the tipping point for you, the Overdale?
Well, it was one of them, but I mean, Overdale was the first major one which caught the public imagination, where people suddenly saw that the MCM was not necessarily going to do all that they had been led to believe that it was going to do. I mean, the MCM was doing many other interesting things at the same time, but the Overdale dossier stood out. And there was lots of protests. Even a certain number of the MCM councillors took part in the protests, including me. And eventually, police were called in to forcibly remove people. There was various kinds of arrests. Housing groups from all over the province, got involved in protesting the city administration. And what it ended up doing was really making a lot of the community groups who normally had been wary about supporting partisan political organizations, but had made an exception for the MCM, now suddenly deciding that maybe that it had been a mistake and that they pulled away. And I would think actually that since that time, there really has not been an open amount of overt partisan political support for a municipal political party from grassroots community organizations. Individuals may have supported different parties along the way, but the kind of upright support that the MCM had by 1986 was, by 1988 had completely, the spell had been broken. And for many of us on the caucus, we found too that the caucus was not operating particularly democratically. Decisions were made. Very often we had no ability within the caucus to influence the policies. We weren't told what was going on. The executive committee met behind closed doors, even from its own caucus. And it was clear that the kinds of democratic participation that many of us have been fighting for many, many years was clearly not going to happen.
Did this whole Overdale situation happen?
Overdale would have first been announced in the spring of '87, which would have been just a bit over 6 months after the MCM was elected.
Was there a linguistic element to this? Because I imagine most of the people who lived in Overdale were Anglophones, and that I think many of the councillors who left kind of represent Anglophone districts, or was there not a linguist? Like, did language have nothing to do with it?
No, language was not an issue. I think, many of the local activities, during the occupation and during the protests, had a considerable English component to it, but many of the people participating in Overdale and the people who were taking part in the occupation, which led to the police action, many were Francophone. The Francophone federations of tenants associations, FRAP, were very much involved. The city councillors who were fighting Overdale, many of them were Francophone as well. No, there was not a linguistic issue. This was very much a question of whether the administration was going to be a supporter or a detractor of tenants' rights.
Okay. So when did you leave? And tell me about the Democratic Coalition that came about after you left.
Well, over the months, after about 2 years of the MCM administration, there was a certain number of councillors who were jokingly referred to by other councillors as the dissidents. Either in caucus or in party meetings or even at city council, we would sometimes vote against some of the propositions of the administration. As far as we were concerned, we were voting in line with the party platform. We were voting in line with the party program, and we were concerned that the party was really deviating from its own program. Whether it was the questions of setting up consultative committees with no decision-making power, whether it was a question of reneging on giving priority to tenants' rights, whether it was the questions of not proceeding quickly on the democratization of different kinds of city services. Within the MCM caucus, the administration was very intolerant of dissidents. Those who took a critical view, even if, in caucus, even if we would vote along with the party at city council, were removed from positions of authority. One of our group that was chair of one of the city council commissions was removed as chair of a city council commission, and even though the person had been nominated for a 4-year term, in fact even went to court to try and get his position back. So there was very little tolerance, and it became very much a question of trying to isolate the group of who were the dissidents. And their associations. I mean, in NDG, where I was, we had an association which had 4 city councillors, and our own local association was quite split, because many of the people in NDG had been active for many, many years and were quite surprised at some of the turns that the administration was taking. But the chair of the executive committee was also an NDG councillor, Michael Feinstadt, at the time. Michael Feinstadt, who I had known since I was about 3 years old. So, we had worked together for a long, long time, for many years since the MCM had been founded. But there were more and more people in the party who were dissatisfied, disappointed, and for several months there was a sort of a dissident group that met, formed a sort of club. We called itself the Club Jaudoin. We invented a fictitious character, Jaudoin, who had been the first union activist elected to Montreal City Council at the end of the 19th century, a person with an Irish mother and a French father who had been very active in trying to work for public health in the municipalized sewer system. I mean, we invented a character who represented the best of what we thought the MCM should represent. And the Club Jaudoin ended up having dozens and dozens of members. We put out our own little news bulletin from time to time. But it became clear that the administration was trying to isolate. The members did not want any kind of dissidence at all. And we started to see many of our friends who are activists just leaving the party, deciding that they didn't really want to spend, invest any more energy. And finally, by the end of 1988, that is halfway through the term, there ended up being several of us who resigned from the caucus.
Including yourself?
Including myself. We were very clear at the time that we supported the party program, and we didn't want to resign from the party, but we wanted to sit as independent MCMers rather than be part of the MCM caucus. The party, however, wanted none of it, and immediately tried to expel us. Our local associations defended us strongly, and there ended up being negotiations going on for several months, and finally the party agreed that it couldn't expel us, but it continued to try to make our lives miserable. Every other councillor ended up getting a local budget for a local office, and we didn't get any money at all. Anyhow, after several months of this, the councillors at different times ended up resigning and just sitting as independents. And then, about a year later,
When did you resign in Citizen Independent?
we resigned from, it was on December 21st, 1988.
Okay.
So that was just about 2 years after the election. It was halfway between two elections. And
And how did the Democratic Coalition come about after that?
well, during,
You left. You had a time.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I'll ask the question again. When did the Democratic Coalition come about?
well, from the time that we left the MCM caucus, we were meeting with various other community groups with an interest in municipal politics. Most particularly, there was a group of municipal Greens who called themselves Montreal Écologique, or Ecology Montreal, who had been interested in municipal politics and had been doing research and publishing position papers. So we held various meetings with them. The idea of calling the new party a Democratic Coalition was that we originally had hoped that various groups who had become disillusioned with the MCM for various reasons might all get together in a kind of coalition, still maintaining some kind of independent identity, but work together. But the people at Montréal Écologique decided that they didn't really want to join us at the time. We weren't green enough for them, and they wanted to have a far more of an environmental aspect, sort of wall-to-wall in the programs. But none of them had ever been elected and didn't have parliamentary experience. So there were different kinds of tensions. But we formed the Democratic Coalition in the spring of 1990, which was about 6 or 8 months before the next municipal election. And in the first election, we came up with a bit of a working deal where Montreal Écologique ran in certain districts and we ran in certain districts. We ended up electing several councillors, and they didn't elect any. So over the next year or two, finally Montreal Écologique ended up agreeing to join in the Democratic Coalition. In the 1990 election, I guess it was then one of the elections along the way, we ran under the title of Coalition Démocratique Montréal Écologique. It was the the two parties together, and our mayoralty candidate was someone who came from Montréal Écologique. But again, none of the Montréal Écologique people got elected, so the Democratic Coalition people. We had 5 Democratic Coalition councillors at various times. We elected, there were 4 of us. One of them lost in another election, and we won a by-election later on. So there was 5 of us at different times who were there.
And what happened to the Democratic Coalition?
Well, the Democratic Coalition continued to exist until 2001, which is the time that the fusion of all the municipalities on the island of Montreal took place, when there was a new city charter. And at that point, both the MCM, which by then had been reduced to a handful of councillors, Pierre Bourque had become mayor in 1994. Both the MCM and the Democratic Coalition ended up sort of folding into the new party, which was put together by Jean Tremblay, which was called the Union des Citoyens d'Île-de-Montréal, which won the 2001 election, and Mayor Jean Tremblay became mayor. So some of the former MCM councillors were elected and ended up playing a certain role in Tremblay's administration, and at least one of the Democratic Coalition councillors also was elected as part of Tremblay's administration.
So When did you stop, when were you no longer a municipal councillor?
I
What have you been doing since then?
I was elected 4 times, 82, 86, 90, 94. In the 98 election, I lost by a hair. I lost by 63 votes. So at that point, I pulled away from municipal politics and I went back to my former job on a full-time basis. I had been a provincial civil servant and I had had a 70% leave for all the years that I was on city council. So I worked the equivalent of about a day and a half a week. But I went back to my full-time job and I continued to be a provincial servant, civil servant for the next...
In what ministry?
Well, at the time I was in the Justice Ministry, I was working as a legal researcher for judges of the Provincial Labour Court. And I was their librarian and a researcher. So I had been there full-time, and then after I was elected, for 16 years I was there part-time, and then I went back full-time. The court was in the process of being dismantled and structures were changed, and eventually I moved over into another ministry, and I spent my last 16 years as a civil servant working for the education ministry in a unit which was in liaison with the English school boards. So it was not a legal job, but I was helping to promote adult education policies, and I was secretary of the Minister's Advisory Board on English Education. And in my latest years, I ended up helping school boards doing strategic planning and working on what was then called partnership agreements, which was, each school board had to have an action plan in terms of trying to improve its performance in a certain number of designated areas. And I worked, so I continued to work at the ministry until around 2015.
And were you involved with a lot of English-speaking community organizations in that job?
I had a fair bit of contact with English organizations, those who were concerned with education most likely. I mean, I was within the school boards. I was, in touch with the school boards, with school commissioners, with the school parents committees, and the various groups, concerned with education in the English sector. I was also involved with various groups dealing with education in the French sector because, the English school boards at that time, were operating. It was the same curriculum. It was the same Education Act. So what applied to one applied to the other. My group at the ministry was involved in helping to implement policies in the English boards, but it was the same policies which were in effect across the province.
And what are some of the challenges and issues you dealt with? What do you see on the English language side in the English language school boards?
Well, there were 2 major issues. I mean, one is that every square inch of Quebec was had both an English and a French public school board, but there were 60 French school boards for the same territory that there was only 9 English boards. The English population was quite concentrated, so there were some, English boards which represented nearly half the province. The same territory that there were 17 French school boards at, but it was still a relatively small board with only 4,000 students. So while there was the same curriculum and there was the same policies, if there were new programs to be administered, the ability to work with professionals in the school system, with teachers in the school system, with administrators in the school system, where they are spread out over a tremendous amount of territory and yet numerically are still very small boards. There was all sorts of challenges that many of the French boards did not have because they were far more geographically concentrated. And the ministry was not necessarily aware of all of these. I mean, just the ability for people from the English boards to get together for professional development sessions, often that involved a day and a half of traveling and involved thousands of dollars for, the same school board represented the Magdalen Islands, the Gaspé Peninsula, and Sept-Îles. And to get people from these 3 areas together, and this was in the days before Zoom, it was difficult, it was expensive. Many of the outlying small English schools didn't have extensive amounts of staff. I was working mostly with the adult education sector, and sometimes a small adult ed center might only have one full-time employee. There'd be a lot of part-time people. But the ability to implement programs and to keep up to date with ministry policies and to provide student services and to provide relationships with the community it presented various challenges. Most of us in our department sat in on all sorts of ministry policy committees, and we used to joke that our major role was to put up our hands and say, hey, don't forget the English, don't forget the English. And there was clearly acceptance of the fact that the people who were writing the policies knew that they were going to be applied in English boards, but there was a certain amount of ignorance sometimes, well-intentioned ignorance about what the actual challenges of implementation were. So that was, my last 15 years as a public servant were dealing with these kinds of issues.
One final question. Where is the English-speaking left today? Do we need an English-speaking left?
Oh, we, as a left-winger, I think we always need an English-speaking left. We need a left of every language. The English-speaking left is diverse in the way that the French-speaking left is also diverse. I'm a senior audit student at Concordia. I take not-for-credit courses and sit in on undergraduate courses, and I read the student newspapers every week. And they're very different from the student newspapers from the time that I was an undergraduate student 50 years ago. There is less concern with organized, structured politics, and there's far more concern with what those of my generation would call identity politics. Questions of gender, questions of identity of different sorts. There is, but on the other hand, at least for students who and young people who have lived in Quebec for the past several generations, the Anglos are far more bilingual than my cohort was. And the ability to not feel that certain parts of the city were off limits just because you didn't know anyone there has changed as far as I'm concerned. I mean, my son, who is just finishing Cégep, has friends in all parts of the city. Clearly, there is less political activity at the municipal level. Both Projet Montréal and Ensemble Montréal have various Anglophones and Francophones taking part, and English-speaking and French-speaking councillors, but there is no party which is really active in terms of involving members in the kind of community organizing and political education activities that I knew in my time. On the provincial level, there are various Anglophones quite active in Québec Solidaire, for example. One doesn't necessarily read about it in the headlines, but a lot of people who traditionally would have been in progressive parties, some of them are still there, and there are Anglophones involved in the Liberals, and Anglophones who were, in the early years of the CAQ, who were quite involved, there as well. And on the federal level, there's people in the Conservatives and the New Democrats and the Liberals, of course. But these are not times these days where activity in organized political parties necessarily has the profile or the attraction, at least from what I'm capable of seeing, that it did at an earlier time. Probably the effect of social media, the effect of the internet, the effect that one is capable of following what's going on in any parts of the world, may mean that people of the younger generation maybe less ambitious in terms of a lot of local day-to-day issues because they realize that the powers of international finance and globalization make it more difficult to bring about social change. On the other hand, there's far more preoccupation with global issues dealing with the environment and dealing with global warming and these issues which involve a multitude of different kinds of activities and not necessarily belonging to one organization that has a monopoly on that kind of political activity.
Lorraine, Anita, do you have any other questions? Is there anything you would like to add that we haven't really covered in the interview?
I would say, both in my work in politics and the fact that I worked for the provincial government for 37 years, I am often, questioned by Anglophones who meet me by saying, but, were you made to feel uncomfortable, working for the Quebec government. Both in politics and in my civil service career, I always found myself made to feel very welcome. I had supervisors in the civil service who were very friendly and welcoming and very helpful when I was working both as the only Anglophone in the entire unit or when I was working in a unit of Anglophones but dealing with the rest of the ministry. In politics, in my dealings, across the city, I think that my feeling was that there was a lot of Anglophones who never tried enough to make contact and to get their toes wet, and who assumed that they weren't going to be liked or assumed that there was going to be prejudice or discrimination. But my own experience was not like that, and I've done all I could in terms of various personal contacts and discussions that I've had to try and encourage people who have interest in politics to actually get involved in the existing organizations, because that's where one can indeed have an impact and as well get to understand a lot more of how our local environment operates.